Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to those in different time zones. I first want to thank you for attending our webinar today. Today we have Melissa Rhodes from the ACASI group, the Arizona Child and Adolescent Survivor Initiative here at the Family Violence Institute. This presentation is called the Arizona Child and Adolescent Survivor Initiative, ACASI, Meeting the Complex Needs of IPH, Child Survivors, and Their Families. This webinar will be recorded and distributed next week with closed captioning. If you're having technical issues, please use the chat pod in the lower right side or contact us at chaira@nau.edu. The last 15 minutes of this webinar will include a Q&A part. Please use the lower right side, the chat pod, for questions and comments. Thank you again for attending our webinar, and we shall begin. Thank you, Melissa.
Good morning from Flagstaff, Arizona. My name is Melissa Rhodes, and I am a licensed clinical social worker. I have been working with children and families, vulnerable populations of children and families, primarily around issues of grief and loss and trauma for the past, about 20 years. That includes 14 years of working with children and families in tribal communities, private practice, and all sorts of other things. Most of the children that I have worked with have been impacted by multiple systems. And so that is how and where I came to ACASI in 2016. I also have 2 teenage boys at home and some dogs and cats and a bird. And thank you for joining us. We are going to talk about ACASI and the children and families we serve. I'm going to open our webinar with a short video. It's about 2 minutes, and it's a brief introduction to our project. And I will warn you that just a heads up, that it starts with a gunshot sound. So that video gave us a snapshot of our project, and it was actually created by some NAU students when we first started ACASI in 2016. ACASI provides specialized services for children who have lost a parent to intimate partner homicide, and their caregivers and families. The grant funded an underserved population, and child homicide survivors are an acutely vulnerable population, and ACASI serves children at any point after the homicide. So sometimes we have referrals that come in, and a week after, 2 weeks after, a month after, 10 years after, 15 years after, depending on what's going on with that family, and then how and when those children end up in Arizona and come to our attention. ACASI provides statewide services throughout Arizona. Our Office of Victims of Crime goals, so the VOCA funding, our goals for ACASI are to support the healing needs, economic stabilization, restabilization, and then justice needs for child homicide survivors and their families following the loss of a parent. And those are big goals. I think if you think about healing, economic stabilization, and justice as we go on through the webinar, everything we do really addresses all of those things. They sound really huge. Sometimes they feel really huge, but that's what we do. The specific crime victimization type that ACASI is funded to serve is technically a survivor of a homicide victim. Our project specifically focuses on a particular type of homicide victim. So when there's been fatal family violence, a mother is statistically, father kills mother, although we have served families where it's gone the other direction and the mother has killed the father. So that's the specific crime type, and it's pretty specific, and we often get questions like, well, what about this type of fatal family violence, or if a father kills a child? We get lots of questions and requests for services in other types of fatal family violence, and recently with special permission, we have started to take some of those. There are some dynamics that are similar. There is a common thread of horrific violence and significant trauma and traumatic loss, and obviously a change in family composition. But and we do some of that as well as some near death, but that is by special permission. When children lose a parent to intimate partner homicide, there are certain aspects that are unique in completely changing the family composition, having children lose their primary caregiver, and then all of that entails in terms of disrupting their home. The direct services ACASI provides are right here. Intensive case management is at the center because everything else emanates from that, and that's the thing that connects all of our clients. We have a small staff of case management coordinator / advocates, and then a volunteer program coordinator who directs the mentoring component, which is off in one of those circles. The information referral and connection, I'll talk a lot more about ACASI services in a little bit after we sort of talk more about what the children experience and their complex needs and their caregivers' needs. But this is sort of a snapshot of what we do. So our trauma therapy that we provide is through community-based contracted mental health providers. They're incredible. I think some of them are attending this webinar, so thank you. And ACASI will connect our clients to all of these different services. And then the mentoring is unique to our program in terms of victim services. So I'll talk a lot more about those in a little while, but our referral sources can be crisis responders, advocates. DCS, for anybody out of state, is our Child Welfare, Department of Child Safety. Other victim service providers, community members, self, we really just don't know, and it's been illuminating for me to be presenting to professional audiences, and this shouldn't surprise me, and then have somebody come up afterwards and say, this happened to my neighbor, my best friend, this happened in my family, and it's that's how it works. Okay, so in terms of being a vulnerable and underserved population, child survivors, there's no mechanism that we're aware of in the United States, and definitely not in Arizona, to uniformly count child homicide survivors, children who've lost a parent to intimate partner homicide. So there's a CDC report that you can see on the slide. 55.3 homicides with female victims between 2003 and 2014 were from intimate partner homicides. So this is a really recent report. It does not mention child survivors. Police forms, when police are on scene or afterward and filling out forms about the crime, there is no box, there is nothing to indicate that there was a child survivor. It may list witnesses, but there is no way to count. And in Arizona, we have a statewide coalition that does some counting and reporting on fatal family violence and DV homicides, and they do an amazing job. And when we compare our list, those are clients that ACASI actually serves, with this list, and I think a lot of that is they have someone who works to monitor media reports. I think the last count was half of our ACASI clients were not on that list. And these three things are important because that is how these kids, these vulnerable victims, survivors, can fall through the cracks. There is really no way. And it also speaks to the lack of research about this population. We'll talk a little bit about one really good study, a recent one, but there really isn't that much. I think I've read most of it, and sometimes the sample sizes for the research are really small, so we are learning a lot as we provide services. This is actually from a couple years ago, and it's just an example of how the media tends to report intimate partner homicides when there are child survivors. And you can, when I was thinking about whether to include this slide and whether it was outdated, just being a couple years old, it's not there. You'll see them all the time. And this is an account of a pretty horrific scene and situation and experience. And it gives you a pretty detailed account of a child witnessing on a street his father shoot his mother and then basically suicide by gun. And the bottom line says the child was unharmed and is in police custody. And that is, I think we get really used to and accustomed to seeing those things, and we know what that means if we stop and think about it. It means the child was physically unharmed. Police custody, that means he's safe. But there is really nothing untraumatizing or okay or normal or about a child being in police custody. Children are not supposed to be in police custody. And we also know unharmed, that child is very harmed in terms of trauma and traumatic loss and the impact that this will have on every aspect of this child's life for a very long time. All of these things, children not being counted, leads to child IPH survivors being considered a group of forgotten victims. And the video said that too. And I think we're used to it, but we're also surprised when someone says, oh, children are overlooked after a homicide. And it is true. And our job is to make sure that doesn't happen. ACASI was developed so that children did not fall through the gaps because children were not getting counseling. Children were not getting hooked up with providers, and families were going largely unhelped and unserved. We know ACASI staff meet amazing providers and advocates and law enforcement who have had lots of interaction with these victims and their families and have done amazing work to support them. But we do know that overall there was still a big gap in services for these kids. The children ACASI serves often lose both parents simultaneously, and so one to the homicide victim, and then assuming there's a charge and a prosecution, the perpetrating parent will be incarcerated, or unfortunately, we work with lots of children where the other parent has died by suicide pretty much at the exact same time. So losing two parents simultaneously is a big thing. After the homicide, right after the homicide, this is sort of what's going on immediately afterwards. If you try to put yourself in the child's shoes, first responders, and that includes, police, fire, law enforcement, crisis response. At that point, some jurisdictions have a crisis response advocate who is sent out, dispatched in Arizona anyway, with 911 calls. But lots of times this is very, things are unfolding fast, and a police department might choose to respond without calling the advocates right away. When the crisis response advocates are involved, I think it's hugely helpful because there is someone who is whose role is to attend to the needs of the children and any survivors or victims on scene. The crisis response advocates that ACASI has encountered, sometimes they have a wonderful packet of information, and it will have mental health resources, just a good packet of really helpful resources given to the victim on scene or an adult on scene. And what we find is that even though that's a great practice and it's much better than not doing that the traumatized brain, and when people are in shock, when things settle down enough for them to maybe look through the packet, there's been funeral arrangements and calling, there's been a lot of things happening and a lot of moving parts. And when families finally have a chance to say, okay, now the dust has settled a little bit, where are those resources? They're not even sure where they went. And so we've heard from crisis responders, this is sort of it's not a criticism, but an observation, is, we don't get to do what we would like to do sometimes. We have to move on, and sometimes families are not ready to utilize the resources that we offer them in that very initial period. Children this is often those three bubbles you see up there are often within the first 1 to 24 hours, and probably a little bit less. So forensic interviews, family advocacy centers might assign an advocate. They might make referrals for services. Even family advocacy center staff say that they make those referrals and they're not often sure what happens after that. And then child welfare is often involved right away, trying to find a family member, next of kin, investigate possible placements for this child, and then make that placement. You can probably guess, and I hopefully started to give you a sense of it, but after the homicide, it's relatively chaotic, and children are interacting with a lot of different people, providers, immediate system concerns. Child welfare will, is the child in a safe place? Prosecution, law enforcement sometimes is looking at the child as a witness, identifying next of kin and placement. And each of these system providers has a very specific job to do and has to focus on that job. And one of the things ACASI can do when we get involved early on is help with that process. Although I have to say, at least in Arizona, we have seen this work pretty well. And the thing to think about too, and this is also what's going on in our minds as soon as we hear about an IPH with child survivors, is what is the child experiencing as this process unfolds? Are they able to have any contact with someone they know? If mom is dead and dad has been taken away, and they are who knows where, who do they have access to? Is it someone they know really well? Are they stuck at an advocacy center with strangers? Do they have anything familiar? What's going on, because they are in shock? What other kinds of things are happening? Sorry, I'm getting a sign that I should speed it up, which is not usually my problem. Usually I'm going too fast. So, and all of these things that you're seeing, you will see in a couple slides that the research shows that each one of these things that's happening is potentially a point of intervention. All of these things could be happening in a way that are considered protective factors for children or are added risk factors. So whether or not someone's explaining to the child what happened, are they helping them gather personal belongings? Are children, there's planning memorials, and familiar adults are also responding to all of this and may be in a great amount of distress. And so if you picture a small child or even an older child on the fringe and watching all this unfold, you get a sense of sort of their emotional and psychological experience. Complex issues. So home can be a crime scene, which means everything that was familiar and supposed to be safe, although there's often been a lot of domestic violence and other things happening up until this point, but children are often removed and barred from entering what is now a crime scene and potentially a very triggering and traumatic scene, but also a place that is familiar and has everything that is familiar to them, including pets and blankets and teddy bears and everything else that they might need. Uniformly shocked, they're shock anxious, they're overwhelmed. The research shows that the proximity to the homicide is very closely associated with the type, degree, and number of post-traumatic symptoms. And very, very important to think about are the multiple significant losses. So children lose their parents, their primary caregivers, their primary attachment figures, the people that would help them feel safe, be safe, and often have to move from their homes, so their belongings. They often are then placed with relatives who may not be in their home community, maybe a state away or cities away, which mean losses of friends and neighbors and schools and pretty much everything that's been familiar to them. The no talk rule, implicit or explicit. And I think my observation is that more recently with family advocacy centers, there's been a real push to have children be able to talk so that they're not shut down by law enforcement or prosecutors, don't talk about it because we need you as a witness. And instead, that testimony is being captured at a family advocacy center through an interview. But the implicit no talk is that children they're acutely aware of the cues and the moods and everything else going around them, and they can see that the adults around them are in shock and grieving and distressed, and that they know why. And so they will often shut down so as not to upset anybody, or because there's a general sense that we just don't talk about this. Trauma triggers, so it may impede grieving. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And these are sort of just complex issues over long term. Complex experience of loyalty and identity, because children are very aware that they are maybe half mom and half dad. And if dad is a perpetrator and has done this horrific thing, but they also loved him and he wasn't always a scary person, then that adds to the loyalty. And depending also on where children are placed, if they are placed with a perpetrator's family, then there's a lot of emotion. And they may hear their father spoken about or their mother spoken about in very, very negative terms, which is difficult. This is critical. The caregivers are almost always also adult homicide survivors. So I think the statistics are also what we see. Statistics I've read about where children end up is also what we see. And very few are in foster care. They may be in foster care for a little while, but most children, overwhelming the majority, are placed with close relatives. So these are their grandparents, often their maternal grandparents, and when it says fathers and mothers, that's fathers and mothers of the homicide victim. So these are people who are also in shock and grieving. They have their own complex issues and needs. They are also dealing with shock about the nature of the death, and then simultaneously demands of instant caregiving for a group of traumatized children. So they maybe are older parents, their grandparents, and now they are taking care of toddlers again when they have not had toddlers in their home for a very long time. They're planning funerals. They're dealing with a lot. Traumatic loss. We hear this over and over and over again, and we see it, that there's a hugely traumatic loss and a lot of grieving to do, which is complicated by the traumatic loss. But they are also dealing with so many other things, and most often trying to attend to the needs of the children. In addition, they have several systems in their lives. So they may be dealing with a criminal trial and responding to law enforcement. They often have child welfare visiting them and asking questions and doing what they do. And so that means going to court possibly for a dependency in juvenile court. They need a lot of resources, and they often do not know where to turn because nobody expected this. So that leads into the stressors. We have clients who find themselves in 3 courts simultaneously. There's a criminal court proceeding going on. There's a dependency court with child welfare, about permanent placement, who's going to get custody, who's going to maybe adopt this child. So they're in that court. And then with ACASI clients, we have a lot who are also dealing with immigration issues. And so 3 courts and all of that other stuff is a huge stressor. Financial, a lot of our families have to stop working, cut work way back to attend to the needs and because of their own distress. So there is, short-term disability, long-term disability related to such an acute and traumatic event, in addition to taking care of the kids and getting them in schools and all of that stuff. The other thing is that everybody comes into this with their own potentially prior trauma and family of origin and family dynamics. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So Alisic et al. 2015, this is one of the best and most recent publications. And Alisic looked at 17 peer-reviewed articles. So took, sort of the best that's out there in terms of studying and looking at this population, reviewed that for themes, and wanted to come up with a conceptual model so that clinicians could think about it and use it for their work with children, but also to prompt further research. And Alisic found in reviewing the literature, those 17 peer-reviewed articles and all of their sample sizes, 4 main categories of outcomes for children: fear, anxiety, social outcomes, physical, academic. And then they also looked at risk and protective factors. So before the trauma, degree of, I think some of it is exposure to trauma ahead of time and some other factors, then things that happened sort of right as the trauma unfolded. So during the homicide and immediately after, and then longer term afterwards. And found, eating and feeding issues. The slide looks like it got a little wonky. Other physical symptoms, so children will have stomach aches, all sorts of things like that. And academic outcomes, poor grades, just a decrease in school functioning. They can't focus, they can't concentrate, they might have trauma triggers, they might be slightly dissociative. So all of the symptoms, sort of post-traumatic symptoms are going to impact them in school. And then the other thing that we notice a lot, usually a little bit later on, that Alisic didn't find, which is why it has a little asterisk, but we see it and respond to it, are trauma-related behavioral problems. And these are unfortunate and have, they're all unfortunate, obviously, but when a child has untreated trauma and very understandable anger and maybe no treatment yet, and complicating factors at home, they may get in fights. If they get in fights and somebody doesn't understand trauma and doesn't understand what it looks like and how it may impact children, then they may get kicked out of school for getting in fights. And that starts a cycle of really amps up the risk factors for those children, because now they are isolated and also handling just the self-esteem and self-efficacy of having failed in school because of something they don't necessarily understand and haven't had any help to resolve. Fears, anxiety, intrusive memories, you can read the list. I think our therapists would say they see all of these in some degree. These are all very expected symptoms after acute trauma. And social attachment difficulties, trying to build new attachments, and other social difficulties, interacting with other people and potential people who could be supportive. But if you have some attachment difficulties and relational problems, then you are potentially cut off from the benefit of those positive social relationships. So after the fact, these are risk factors. Suicide by perpetrator, proximity to the event. I've talked about some of these. If they're given incorrect information, the level of distress for their caregivers, when placements change and break down, siblings split. And you can look at all of these and think, especially as you go down, caregiver distress, starting there and going down, those are things that are more post-trauma. But these things happen a lot. A lot of families may be mixed, and we work with lots of families where there are, 3 or 4 kids or 5 children maybe share they have the mother in common, and she's been the victim, but there are they have different fathers. And so in addition to losing mom and dad, they then lose a sibling because a biological parent will come back, and either the child will be placed with that biological parent, or there will be a court case and a custody battle over who's going to get that child. And so there are other losses. Splitting parents into good and bad is a risk factor, and that naturally happens. Our criminal justice system does that. It has to, but it does. And then also perpetrators, parents and victims' parents and families, understandably, have a lot of intense emotions, and these messages, they're all over the place, and kids get them. Even when I know lots of families try not to do that, but it kind of happens anyway. Having to give evidence in court and confront a perpetrator in a legal process is a risk factor, and conflict, we alluded to that one. Protective factors. You can look at some of these. Early psychological assessment intervention, possessions of the deceased, broader services, opportunity to see the body, participate in, go to the funeral. And those things sometimes don't happen for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes protective family members feel that, understandably, this is such a horrible thing. I don't want this poor child to have any other, exposure or memory of this or whatever. And it comes from a good place, but we know that is not how little people work. So homicide and the victim and perpetrator talked about freely. Again, survivors, adult survivors and family members may avoid doing that because of their own traumatic stress. That might be a very natural symptom for them, the adult survivor, but it is also setting up a risk factor for the children and modeling that maybe they can't talk about it freely either. Connecting with support of others, using rituals. The symptoms are acknowledged by caregivers and follow up by initiating mental health care. And sometimes that doesn't happen for a while not because the caregivers aren't, very caring and wanting to be protective and attend to the children's needs, but simply because they are so utterly overwhelmed and in shock and grief-stricken. And so that may take a while. Actually receiving the care, and then social supports outside the placement or home. So having children integrated in other places and connected to other adults and peers who can be supports is also a protective factor. And what you will see, hopefully, is that when I get into the ACASI services, that our services are designed to, hopefully, we attempt to mitigate the risk factors and then put in as many of the protective factors as we possibly can, and then support them. And I really think when we look at what we do day in and day out, that those are really the things that guide us. And why this one is different, why an intimate partner homicide and losing a family member this way is different. One of the biggest things for children is that they are losing the attachment figure in the relationship that would have otherwise helped support them through something horrible. We know from the ACEs research and from our own lives and our work that there is lots of trauma all over the place, right? And children weather lots of trauma, big traumas, little traumas. But when they do it with their attachment figure, it's a different thing. When that person who helps them be okay is gone, that's a it's another level of loss and sort of the shaking of the foundation for a child. And then compound effects, when I talked about all the multiple losses, Alyssa talks about that too. So they lose the loved one and the one who would help them, but then also all of those other things, maybe siblings, home, familiarity, everything that they have been living with as stability for a long time. Caregivers' traumatic stress, grief, and overwhelm impacts parenting and the ability to respond to the child's needs. And that is one of the things I think our therapists focus on a lot. They may be, the client may be the child survivor, but there's a lot of work with the caregiver so that they are in a good position to respond to those children. And that sort of lack of fit between the adult homicide survivor's capacities after such a traumatic loss and the acute needs of the child survivor. So we do a lot, and our therapists do a lot to try to support that and support the caregivers so that they can then attend to the children, because that's who's raising them and that's the new attachment relationship. The other thing that complicates or understandably makes the work sometimes take longer and definitely makes it more complicated is that the caregivers come to this event and their new role with their own trauma histories, and that may impact their ability to attach. We have caregivers who had their own significant trauma and traumatic loss, abuse, neglect as children, and that has affected them, and now they are thrown into this relationship with lots of trauma triggers because it just happened again, and there are traumatized children in their homes. Caregivers being able to regulate their own emotions, and all of that can be important clinically, and then also for ACASI staff. And then conflict between relatives, and that just makes everything more complicated and a little bit more stressful. If you think about children and families after divorce, this is like that, but more. Then right around now, I like to say that we know this too. Children and adult survivors have strengths, resilience, and incredible capacities for healing. And the stories, as many horrific, sad, tragic things that we encounter and we see and we know have happened and we bear witness to, we also see so much traumatic growth. And those stories are fortunately the ones we try to hang on to, and it's pretty incredible what our children and our families have been able to do. So being able to bear witness to that also is the flip side, and I think keeps us going. And then even though some of the places the children end up briefly are complicated, most of them join loving homes of loving family members, and that's a good thing. So implications for professionals and systems. One of the things that we found initially, although fortunately in Arizona, even in the 4 years or so that ACASI has been in existence in providing services and working with child welfare, DCS, there have been some amazing changes. But initially, DCS is getting involved with our families through an atypical route. It's not that there was a substantiated report for abuse or neglect. It is DCS gets involved because there are children with no parents, and that's why they get involved. And so some of the initial response when there's an investigation about physical safety and all of those things are different. And early on, there were some situations where it really didn't seem to be working as well as it could have for the children and families that we were working with. And best cases, it was working really well, and there were professionals who understood that it was a different situation, that their role was slightly different. And then in some cases it was rough and we needed to do some advocacy. Placement decisions are critical and can be complicated. Critical because these are the folks and these are the places that are going to help these acutely traumatized, traumatically bereaved children heal. They're going to give them the stability. And that's a tall order. And I think there's often, everybody sometimes on a team or responding to these children is scrambling a little bit, trying to place the kids as best as they can in the most supportive place where there might already be attachment. So you're looking at who's the child, who in the family do they already know, who's around, who can we get to. Sometimes they're out of state. That, for anybody who is familiar with this on the legal side or the welfare side, that means looking at a compact with another child welfare system in another state, and all of those things take time. People have asked, should children be placed with perpetrators or perpetrators' family or victims' family? Illicit actually did not classify that in a risk or a protective factor because it was unclear. And I would say we have seen that too. I would say by and large, mostly children are placed with the victim's family, but there have been situations where the entire team said, nope, the perpetrator's family is where the children are most comfortable, they are healthy, that is a supportive environment, there are no red flags, this is really where the children should go to. And then there's a lot of work after that, because everybody in the family on either side has a lot of emotion, and that needs to get sorted out and supported so that the children will have the freedom and the support and the permission to process their own experiences, their own alliances, their own attribution of blame. They have a lot to work out, and it can be hard. It's sort of a loaded environment that they're going into on either side. So, but the placement decisions are critical. There's a critical role of advocacy because these children have power over pretty much nothing at this point. And all of the systems and all the moving parts are making a lot of decisions that impact them immensely, and they do not really have a say necessarily. So victim service units, DCS now has a victim service unit that's been very helpful. Guardians ad litem, CASAs, court-appointed special advocates, and victims' rights attorneys. ACASI has done as much as possible to work with all of these folks, and they can be huge advocates and have a huge role in speaking up for kids and their needs. And what we try to do then is make sure any of those folks who ask for it and want it have whatever we know about the clinical piece of what the children are going through. Importance of multidisciplinary approach so that people aren't working in a silo. Plus, there are so many moving parts. If you don't talk to each other, you really make a mess. And certainly do not serve families as well. And then treatment matters. The timing, the access, the training of treatment providers. ACASI building something new. And I will just say that when the director of the Family Violence Institute said, would you like to take this on and try to, and work on building this system that supports kids? At that time in 2016, there was nothing in the nation like it. And there was one program in Baltimore County that was doing something similar, but otherwise, a project like ACASI specifically focused on meeting the needs of this particular victim population did not exist. And of course, I am a social worker and maybe crazy and said, sure, that sounds great. And I walked into his office my first day, and I think I said something like, so tell me who I call and where are the books and and he just looked at me and said, well, there isn't one. This is the first one. And I went back to my office and closed the door and said, where are my big girl pants? And then we got busy. And so the upside of building something new is that we get to invent things. One of our staff members says it's like flying a plane while you're building it. And there are days where it feels like that. But we get to do a lot of innovative things, and we really get to ask not just what's available out there, but what's needed. And I love that we get to do that. This is back to what you saw before. And let me just look at the next slide real quick. Okay. I'll just make a couple quick comments about this. So information referral and connection. And we all know there are lots of different ways to do that. It sounds really simple, but you can hand someone a piece of a brochure and say, here, these guys do this, good luck. Or here's 5 names that you can do this with and good luck, although we don't say good luck. And then that can be the extent of that process. But what what we pay attention to is knowing how overwhelmed and how overwhelmed and how at diminished capacity a lot of our caregivers and families are, especially initially, and that calling maybe a large community mental health agency, even if once you get inside there are some excellent clinicians, but if you're already overwhelmed and depressed and maybe barely getting out of bed and barely functioning and dealing with post-traumatic stress, plus a lot of little people in your house who have the same thing, if you can't get a hold of someone the first 5 times, you may give up. And not because you don't care about meeting the children's needs and getting the help, but because you simply cannot do it. That is the brain with trauma. There's forgetfulness. There's all sorts of things. And so when we provide a referral, we are handing our clients off. There's a warm connection. We've done that ourselves. I will ask a case manager, so keep calling. Have you gotten in there yet? No, keep calling. I want you to keep calling. And they will kind of, sometimes look at me like, really? And I will say, yes, because if you understand this system and you can't get where you need to go, then I don't know that our families are going to have a much more luck. So warm connections, advocacy involves, it's a broad category. Sometimes that advocacy can look like going to a school over and over again and working with a principal and a teacher to try to help them understand trauma and empower them with information and work with them to better respond to one of our clients. It can look like that. It can look like getting involved with employers, helping fill out paperwork for long-term disability. It can look like making sure the guardian ad litem has all of the information they need from the therapist, writing letters. It's pretty broad. Our case management coordinators, ACASI, and our volunteer mentors do a lot of ongoing emotional support. Mostly that's our case managers. Peer group support, we'll get a little bit into that, and because we have an interesting way of doing that. We don't have up regularly running groups, but we have found another way to do that. We have a mentoring program, and then the trauma therapy, which I talked about a little bit. So just to give you a sense of that there is recognition at the federal level and with funders that this population needs something different. And the OVC recognized that homicide survivors in particular need skilled intensive support to cope with traumatic, intensely personal loss. It is not like other things. There is a lot of research about homicide survivors and the impact of homicide as a pervasive event that will come back off and on. It's something people learn to live with. It can be isolating, and it takes a lot of intensive support. And this is another statement that from Holistic, the research. Children involved often need long-term intensive mental health and social services case management. And the costs of these services are extensive, and the stakes are very high of not getting it. One thing that wasn't in the slide earlier is that maybe 10 years ago, but another good piece of research found that very, very few child survivors of homicide ended up seeing a therapist, and if they did, it was only for a couple sessions. And we have heard that over and over again, even now in larger areas where there should be good services, is that if you go into a therapist's office where they don't understand trauma, or they just haven't had the training and they don't have the expertise, that can be not just ineffective, but potentially even harmful. And we have had clients say, well, the very second session, the therapist went straight into the trauma and asked the child about, what happened and what did you see and what happened to mom, and that basically shut things down. We've also heard that the therapist looked like they were traumatized and people decided not to go. So the need for intensive services. And ACASI we find with our families, there's a period of very intense work at the beginning where all those moving parts, and we are really, really busy and with our clients a lot in terms of phone contact, texting, doing lots of different things, in-person services. And then over time, the needs will evolve, the capacities will evolve. And fortunately, and as long as we're funded, we can step in and out sort of as families need us and then don't need us, and then adjust our services accordingly. The things that the CMCAs, those are our, I'm the clinical director, then we have case management coordinators / advocates who do most of the direct work with our clients. I do some too, but this is, I would say, they would say this is what they do most. The intensive case management, advocacy, and emotional support. And the emotional support happens in many different ways and frequently, and it involves sensitive engagement. So sometimes we will have a client, a caregiver who does not call, does not reach out for a period of time. And I think some, if you don't call your cardiologist, they don't call and check on you and say, hey, how's your heart? But we know that just because a caregiver might not be reaching out to us, that doesn't necessarily mean they don't need anything or that they're okay. So it's a balance of knowing our clients and knowing, sort of how they are and how they operate, when they're coping, when they're doing well, when they're not doing well. And our case managers will reach out with a quick text or a phone call and a message and say, hey, how you doing? Call me if you need me, just checking in. And, there have been instances where someone will say to us, I was just too depressed. Thank you so much for calling. And then there's some more engagement and then another assessment with them of what the priorities are and what they need. Our case manager, we attend to victims' rights. We go to court. We work with, others victim service providers. There's overlap in these things. I think a lot of different victim service providers or advocates might do bits and pieces of this. So when we get engaged with a referral or a referral source or a family, we will, of course, initially just see what's already been done. Who's done this? Who's done what? Get a sense of the team, and then what's sort of left over. What can ACASI do to help? And, sometimes the victim compensation process got missed because, things are moving fast, and so we'll pick up that piece. There are amazing victim advocates who do court-based advocacy and accompaniment. And if the client says, I love my advocate and we're all good here, then we say, awesome, we'll just do other stuff. So the collaboration with other providers is really critical so that we know where we're needed and where we can kind of back off because someone else has it. I mentioned this, in the immigration law thing, all of these things are hugely stressful for families. So in addition to the stress of parenting and everything else that happens because of a post-homicide, being involved in a lawsuit or in even a civil matter or in court is stressful. It's foreign. There are a lot of things that people have to do. You think about filling out paperwork and meeting with different people, and that's just compounded. The immigration law piece is a hot topic around the country, of course. And from our perspective, there are a lot of things from our perspective. I think we're all social workers on our team, and so there's a lot of ethics and values that are part of our professional identity and training. But also, it's about attachment. When you have a child who has lost the big people who keep that child tethered to the planet, and they are now with grandma or grandpa, and that is the loving person who is keeping them safe and nurtured and tethered to the planet. And that person, there is a threat in that home that person will be removed from the country. That undermines stability, healing, well-being, and, so I try to remind people, I don't, whatever side of that debate you fall on, for us, immigration is about attachment and people having access to the people that keep them okay. So we have facilitated connections with immigration attorneys who have pursued U visas and whatnot on behalf of our caregivers so that they are not removed from the country and separated from their children after losing a daughter or a son, and the children don't lose that caregiver. We do lots of work with stakeholders, and this is huge. ACASI is, I think it's true for anybody. I think it's true when you have families with multiple needs and who are involved in multiple systems. But all of the stakeholders, and I can say stakeholders are our clients. Stakeholders are anybody who's involved in either, making this better, helping families heal, responding, or just living next door to, or having a kid in a classroom. But it really takes a village. So our approach is that we recognize and appreciate their experience, expertise, and roles. We do find, and I think it's interesting, but there are all sorts of reasons. But we will find folks that just say, hey, we've got this completely covered. And if they really do, then that's great, because we will go do, there's plenty of work to do. But I think everybody is often just so busy doing their own job that sometimes it can be hard to remember that we all really do better work sometimes when we're talking to each other and working together. The other thing is ACASI. I started to say ACASI is small, and we absolutely value and depend upon collaborating with community-based providers. So our little project sits in northern Arizona. We have staff in Phoenix, the Phoenix area, and down in Yuma County. And we have a big state with lots of rural areas. And so we do a lot of driving, but we absolutely depend on collaborating and coordinating services with all of those community-based providers. So that is a big job. It's one of my favorite parts of the job, is meeting those folks and developing relationships so that we can do it well and we know each other and we respect each other, because at the end of the day, we're all working for the same families, and we do it better when we do it together. Also, those relationships help with cross referrals and resource sharing to reach more victims. So the more open and sort of generous we are with our expertise and our willingness to talk to each other and work with each other, I think we provide better services. And then, I think once a crisis responder called me on scene it was a suicide. There was actually no necessarily not what we do. There wasn't any domestic violence or family violence involved, but there was a child witness to a parent suicide. And I was glad that person called. And so we chatted for a while, and I was, tried to provide some other resources, and we brainstormed, we put our heads together. And even though that wasn't necessarily what we do, I was really glad that person called. ACASI has a mentoring program. And this is, it's different from Big Brothers, Big Sisters, but I always throw that out as the closest thing just because people have heard about it. And it is set up a little bit like that. So, but there is research that shows, lots of research, that shows that having one in a child, for a vulnerable child or an at-risk child, the presence of one stable, or where they went, the presence of one stable, consistent adult has a huge protective factor in mitigating risk. And that is borne out in our work over and over and over again, especially when you think, and I've said it a million times now, that our families are overwhelmed. And so having a mentor who can come in and take that child out and just attend to them, and the mentor is not overwhelmed and traumatized. The mentor is there to pay attention to that child so that child can be enjoyed and listened to and validated and have fun and go explore the community and see who they are when they are, not just, or not in this, dealing with all this stuff. Our mentors and it's also about community engagement and helping children explore their interests and maybe, and also engage with the community and do things like that. So that's a huge part of our program. Our children and families value this. And occasionally we'll have a mentor, who we have a 1-year commitment, but a mentor who will have to disengage either at that year or earlier for something. It's rare, but those children and families ask for another one. They have specialized training to, just so they have some orientation or awareness of our kiddos and what their needs are. ACASI has been able to, since we are all about bridging gaps, early on, we had a grant from Verizon that helped us with giving children tablets. We have sort of rolled that into some other grant funding to provide iPads to clients who are in remote areas where there are not I would say, I was going to say specialized providers, trauma providers, but maybe not really even providers at all. And so those pictures are representative of some areas that we have been able to serve. And with the telehealth, we can connect somebody in a very remote rural area who would not otherwise have access to any kind of services often, or resources, because of the remoteness, because of the expense and time it takes to travel to a place where there might be a good therapist or someone who's able to serve that family, and that family will have an iPad in their house, and through a protected and HIPAA compliant platform, they can be hooked up with our amazing therapists who might be in Phoenix or in Flagstaff. Telehealth has also allowed us to keep kids with their trauma therapist after they have relocated to another community, and that's been incredible. So after the therapeutic rapport that's necessary and most helpful, actually I would just say necessary, in helping these kids do trauma work over time, if you have to keep switching therapists, that's really disruptive. And so if we can help that not happen with telehealth, then we'll do that. So that's been exciting. I mentioned our peer group support, and because groups, anybody who out there who's ever tried to start a group, or groups are very hard to get going, and we are all over the state, and so we haven't found a way to do that. But what we have done, we have a partnership with Healing Lands, and that's a long story. You can look up for more information about this, but we have taken a group of our child homicide survivors, ACASI clients, on a river trip with their peers. So because we know transportation is a barrier, ACASI has picked up the kids around the state, brought them all together, and we went on a river trip. It's sort of a floating peer support group, with all the benefits of having children in nature. And we are fully funded to do this again in June. I will also go, and one of our therapists and some other amazing people will go and take, I think this year we will have 11 child survivors on this river trip. And it's been incredible. Being able to witness the compassion, the empathy, the understanding that the kids give each other, they're in a position to give each other, was absolutely incredible. There is research, there are studies that look at the effect of being in nature on cortisol levels and post-traumatic stress indicators, physiological indicators. We are not in a place to do that with our kids, but anecdotally from watching them, I can tell you it was pretty amazing. The kids talked about it. Caregivers said they came back more relaxed, and the children had the experience of being able to support each other, and that was also really powerful. That is our group at the end of our first river trip. We have a few more minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So just lessons learned, and I'll try not to repeat myself, but the importance of wraparound services and the intensive case management that is available over time. And so one thing that other providers, may not be in the position to do, even though a lot of them say they would like to because they'd like to see outcomes, is to be able to be involved with families over a period of time. So if crisis responders are in and out, when victim advocates with the court process, they might be done, but we can stick around. The importance of partnerships, we talked about immigration complexity. The intergenerational work is intense. I think I started to talk about that, but sometimes the children will have primarily worked through a lot of the post-traumatic stress symptoms, and then we start in on how to help their caregivers heal from some of the things that have happened in their own development, so that they are in a position to better parent these kids over time, and also just function better for themselves. It takes a lot of staff to do this. There's a lot of organization. This is a new program, so the administrative piece, vicarious trauma. We sit with children and families, and our therapists sit with children and families after horrific, traumatic, violent events, and that is something we try to pay attention to. And the vicarious trauma is it's probably just trauma. And so we are hearing these stories and paying attention to that in our staff as service providers has been really important. Timing and type of therapist. I started to mention that, and I won't go too into it, but that is really important. And it is not to diminish, discredit, or anything else the expertise and the efficacy and the healing capacity of all sorts of providers out there. But if somebody does not understand homicide, the impact of homicide, the traumatic nature of the event plus the loss, we have found our clients have not been as well served, which is why we have specific therapists with certain kinds of training that we connect them with, and then things have been pretty amazing. Significance of mentors, I talked about. The traumatic growth and resilience is just huge, and we don't have time for me to give you all the great stories that I would love to be able to share, but our kids get better and they do amazing things, and and the rewards of the work are huge. We do lots of hard stuff, but being able to watch our families get through some of this and make progress and get back up on their feet and is what keeps us going. This is under a minute video that I'll wrap up with. And the presenter in this is a woman named Danya Witherspoon Falco, and she lost her father shot and killed her mother when she was, I want to say, in her early 20s. And the whole video you can find. Ray will give you a link to it. It's pretty powerful. And she spoke alongside with one of the first researchers in this area. And she, just as you hear her, think about the fact that she was 20 and out on her own. She'd already gone to college and had a lot more agency and access and ability to control her own life. And she's going to talk.
What I experienced was isolation. People are afraid of me. I learned early on that people, even professionals, CPS workers, police, people are afraid to get close to someone that's experienced that much intensity, and they're afraid that we're fragile and we're going to break if they talk to us. So what do? They leave us alone, and we have to deal with all of this on our own. In worrying about saying the wrong thing, we get stuck in a world that we have to navigate with maybe not the best skills because we were not raised in a normal situation, and we have to find our way in life alone. And that was where I found myself.
Lots of victim service providers that this is what we do, and it's hugely impactful. And our families tell us it's hugely helpful that we show up and have the courage to stand in the truth with them as they go through what they're going through. I was reminded, thankfully, that I talked about the river, and our river trips are not standalone. That part of that partnership is to also take this group of kids who've been on the river together and had this intense experience, but to get them back together and do camping trips and other peer support in the natural environment. And so this is a new thing for us. So we had one river trip and one camping trip, and it was amazing. And our therapist will tell you that those kids have been saying, when do we get to go? When do we get to go on the next river trip? And that's coming up. The other thing is that in addition to supporting the children, we have started offering support groups for the caregivers, so the adult homicide survivors. There is an amazing organization in Tucson that provides that ongoing for homicide survivors. Ours is focused more on it's on the caregivers, and so we try to attend to those needs because they have so much in common in terms of the stresses, the complicated issues, the trying to grieve and find time to grieve when you're parenting toddlers, and they have said to us over and over again, we want to talk to other people who understand what we're going through. And so that is another piece that we're trying to make happen. But again, we're a baby program and there's not a lot of us, but we listen to our clients and that's what they've asked for. So that's what we're doing. Okay. Let's see, contact information, and then again, just thank you to the Arizona Criminal Justice Commission because they funded the series of webinars on our client population and our project, and that's how to reach me if you have any questions. And if you are from anywhere in the state or anywhere in the country and you have questions or you want to know anything about ACASI, I am happy to lay it all out there and tell you what we did that I wish we hadn't done. I will tell you what the hard lessons we've learned, and that is, I have, had calls from Georgia and Florida and Ohio and other Montana and California. And that's a really fun part of my job because then I get to hear what they're doing and what they're seeing. And then they get to learn from our successes and our things that have been a little bit more challenging. Okay, here we go. First question that Ray highlighted for me is, are there books or resources for caregivers to answer questions and discuss the specifics to children who are asking? Yes. The short answer, Mary Lou O'Connell, is yes. For me to rattle them off here, it would be painful for you because I would have to remember them all, and that would be really not fun to watch. So if it's okay with you, I am happy to attach to Ray, you can tell me, I'll ask Ray how to best get this out to everybody.
So Mary Lou, we'll have a email that's sent out with the presentation and the webinar recording, and we'll attach that to that.
Yep, I will attach. I am always happy to share anything I've ever heard of that seems like a good idea. So we do have resources and books and all sorts of things. And I've accumulated them from presenting on panels with other people, and I will share whatever I have, and I will just attach those resources to the PDF so that everybody can have them. Thank you for that. Okay, Chuck Johnson asks, hopefully I'm allowed to identify Chuck. Are all of those issues, relevant for a child who's, regardless? You know, that's a really good question. I'm going to guess that so I guess what I think that I'm understanding is, a parent, never mind, hold on, let me slow down. Okay, parent who has been killed. So I'm trying to think of other situations. So killed in a car accident, killed in a non-familial homicide. Trauma and traumatic grief are going to share similar risk factors, I think, and have similar protective factors. Alyssa specifically looked at, let me see. Oh, shoot. I guess I can't. Can I go back? Sorry, we're just zipping back through let's see. Okay, risk factors. Okay. So I think if you look at some of these, a parent being killed in another way, like if it's in combat, a lot of these things won't apply. I would say if you look at these, a lot of these are probably pretty specific. Proximity to the event, I would say that could be, you're going to have more post-traumatic stress symptoms, potentially that overwhelming experience of being present for something that traumatic and threatening to your survival. Caregiver distress, yes, if a parent is killed in another way and the surviving parent has distress, that will be, so I know this answer is never very satisfying, but it kind of depends. So anything that's related to trauma and traumatic loss, I would say yes. Let me look at Ray, can you go to the next? Thank you. Yes, early psychological assessment and intervention, I would say that's a protective factor. Opportunity to see the body. So any of those things where you can say that is relevant. Clinically, this is just my clinical impression. I'm not going off of a review of the literature, but I would say just as a clinician, I would say yes, absolutely. And that, that IPH, when a parent, and I think I've talked a lot about this, but when the trauma and traumatic loss and death comes from an intimate partner homicide, there are so many layers of identity, and home is supposed to be safe and nurturing, and it's not. And these people are supposed to protect you, and they can't. there's a lot of things that add layer upon layer to that. I think if there's a death of a parent and there's a mom or a parent is left behind, then that child does not lose that attachment figure. And as long as that person gets support, they can help the kids. So I hope that that's an okay answer. Okay. How do you ensure the therapists you contract are offering trauma-informed care? That's another good question. We don't contract. That is actually one of my roles as the clinical director is to identify and get enough information from talking to someone who heads that agency and understanding the training, but also just talking to the therapists and doing sort of my own vetting and assessment. That is how. So it is, our providers in Phoenix, we were lucky that I feel very, very fortunate that I knew the clinical director of a part of that agency that was so well equipped and trained to provide this kind of therapy. And so we contracted with a group of those folks and worked really closely with them. And then in the community, in Flagstaff, I've been in this community for a long time and knew and had worked with really amazing therapists. And then the other thing, so in terms of my own vetting, that's pretty much how we do it. And basic levels of training, the certified clinical trauma professional training as a basic foundation, and then there are lots of other things that really make that a therapist more available to do that. The other thing is that when we first started ACASI, one of our consultants was somebody who had done some of the research in this area, and she said a wonderful thing our very first statewide conference, which was, if you're going to do this work, you have to be willing to be a learner and a teacher, because it is different and it is nuanced and it is complicated. And so as an experienced clinician and fortunate to work with such incredible, talented folks, we are all talking to each other all the time. I talk to a therapist or more daily. So we consult all the time. So even if you have the training, I think practicing doing this kind of work in a vacuum and not connected with other people, I haven't met someone who would want to do that by themselves. So that's a really kind of long answer, but that's kind of how we do it. How many staff would you recommend for a county of 1 million? Oh boy. Okay, our program manager person is sitting across from me to give me cues on timing. I'll ask her for a second. 1 million. I'm so bad at numbers. So what's a county of 1 million, you guys? Anybody know? Millions. Yeah. So if Phoenix has upwards or 4 million-ish, nobody quote me. I'm not good at numbers. We have, for all of ACASI, there's me, the clinical director, 3 direct service staff, a volunteer program coordinator, and then our program manager admin. So we have 5 part-time, and she's part-time. We have 5, and we have 4.5 full-time staff. We need more. We drive a lot. We work really hard, times 3. So I would say 5. I would say 5. And also it depends on the infrastructure. If you are, and the number of intimate partner homicides. So some of our rural counties do not have, because they're rural and the population's not big, they don't have a lot of homicides. If your county of 1 million happens for whatever reason to have that happens to be a thing, then you would need more. It also depends on where if you're starting in a agency or a setting that already does some of these pieces. Anyway, it's complicated, but I would say we need more, and 1 million, I would say start with 5. Okay, how do cases get referred to your program? I can answer that one. From victim service providers, we will have victim advocates will call us, DCS, child welfare will now call us. They will get one of these cases or they will engage with one of these families and say, oh, ACASI, and call us. Other service providers, therapists might call us. We got a referral from, these are just some examples from a grief program that and they had somebody come in and the caregiver wanted the child to join the grief group. And after hearing the story and knowing that the child had no trauma work whatsoever, said, you know what, maybe ACASI would be a good place to start, because I don't think this kiddo is ready to do this work or to be in a group. She hasn't had any of her own trauma work. Attorneys, prosecutors, anybody can refer. We self-refer too. We had an attorney that was involved with our institute in another capacity and said, hey, those are my neighbors. And then we got a referral that way. Are visitors from other states welcome to visit and see how you operate? Yes, you could, but I don't know what you would see. We actually have had that question. And I would say, give me a phone call and I'll tell you as much as I can and share what I can from you. But watching how what's that? Yeah, but most of our services are in home. And so due to client confidentiality, we can't necessarily do that. What we would look like is people who sit in the office, sometimes for 9 hours at a time behind a closed door, answering phone calls and emails. And then we get on the road and we drive all over the state and meet with our families. So I appreciate the question. But give me a call and I'm happy to tell you everything I know. Oh, how our program and services are funded. ACASI got started with a VOCA grant, and is VOCA was the startup funding. We have some private foundation funding from the NARBA Institute, which serves Northern Arizona. We've had a little bit of Verizon funding for telehealth, and we are constantly looking for other sources of funding. And then we get some funding from our some financial support from Northern Arizona University, where we're located. And would you have any tips for getting similar programs off the ground in other areas? That's a really big question with a really big answer. So yes, give me a call. I'm happy to talk to you. It would be great to learn how the ACASI staff engage in self-care and manage potential organizational trauma. Yes, Michelle, that is, we talk about that a lot. I think the biggest thing is not moving so fast that we forget the impact that it could have on us, and then constant, having check-ins, debriefing. We are small, we are pretty well connected, and we have access to each other all, quite often. So it is pretty routine right after a new intake or even an intense meeting with a family for whoever did that meeting to call myself or to call Holly, who's our program manager, and debrief. And so we try to be really mindful of doing that and asking each other. But that's a really good question, because we often, even though we preach it, we often forget to put the oxygen on ourselves before other people. So that's a really good question. And sometimes even with my experience, it will bite me in the butt when I'm not expecting it. And I will come back to our office after a really intense interaction or hearing a story that for some reason or another just really hit me in a different way, and run around the office and be mean to people for a second. But that's really not who I am. So usually I figure it out and go apologize. But the attention, knowing that, not thinking that we're immune or not vulnerable to that, because what makes us really good at our jobs are the fact that we're empathetic and compassionate and have mirror neurons. And those are the things that will also make this stuff traumatizing to us as providers. So I hope I answered your question in there somewhere, but paying attention and making sure we ask each other, and then very, very good support of, if you need a day, take a day. If you don't feel up to it, if you had a really tough couple sessions, talk to one of us, and we'll find a way to support you. Our institute, NAU, also has access to employee wellness, and we're able to access those resources. So, and we just were able to go to a conference where Laura Vandernoot of Trauma Stewardship spoke, and that for me was exactly the oxygen I needed. So anyway, I'm happy to talk to anybody about anything more. Call me, email me, and I'm happy to answer more questions. Thank you so much for giving up an hour and a half